Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the Raising Special Kids Quick Connecting Live series. I'm Brittany Miller, and I'm excited to be back today and talk about some more special education related topics that we hear from families all the time at Raising Special Kids. So for those just joining us today, we are going to be going over the special education eligibility categories under IDEA. So let's get to it because we got a lot to talk about today. So parents call Raising Special Kids all the time asking questions about, how does my child become eligible for an IEP? What criteria do they have to meet? What are all these categories? It can be very overwhelming for families. And so we wanted to take some time today, especially in this busy back to school season, to go over what that means. And if you have questions, of course, we're here to answer them for you. But we wanted to give a quick overview about the IDEA special education eligibility categories. So let's get to it. So preschool. So if your child has been evaluated and determined eligible for developmental preschool, there are different categories of eligibility that they could fall under. Before any of that happens, though, before a child is to be determined to be eligible for special education, they have to meet 3 criteria. So I'm going to go over them with you. So first, the child must have a qualifying disability as defined by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act regulations. Second, the disability must have an adverse effect on the child's educational performance. So remember, the disability alone doesn't qualify them. It must affect them adversely educationally. And third, the child must need specially designed instruction in order to access and make progress in the general curriculum. And that specially designed instruction is a term you'll hear, especially in regards to an individual education program, an IEP. So those 3 criteria need to be met for a child to be determined to be eligible to be evaluated for special education. So if those 3 things happen, and the school says, yes, okay, we agree that your child needs to be evaluated for special education services. They give you that prior written notice with their decision in there, and they have you sign a consent form. At that point, they're going to schedule the evaluations and test your child and see what their strengths and deficits are and figure out what category makes them eligible for special education services. So jumping back to preschool, so there are 5 categories. There is developmental delay. And just briefly discussing this category, I'm going to be referring to the Arizona Department of Education. They have a great resource on their website that we'll put in the comments that goes over each of these categories in more detail, but just briefly discussing each of them. It's for a child who has 2 or more delays in the areas of cognitive, physical, communication, social, emotional, and adaptive development. So that is for the developmental delay category. For preschool severe delay, looking at the child's needs in those same areas, but more severely. And so that may be why maybe they have more severe delays. That's why they get that designation. And then speech and language impairment, hearing impairment, and visual impairment. So those 5 categories are the eligibility categories under IDEA for developmental preschool. So just before we move on to K through 12, we often get calls from families often kind of confused. Well, my child has a medical diagnosis. Why is that not the category on their IEP? I don't understand. So IDEA special education eligibility categories are not a medical diagnosis. Literally when a school is evaluating your child, each of these categories have a set of criteria they have to meet. So they're going to look at those evaluation results. The school, the MET team, and the psychologist, they're going to interpret those evaluation results and figure out which category your child meets the criteria for. So it's important to remember that. There's a lot of confusion, especially with the autism eligibility versus medical diagnosis, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But just to remember that these categories in special education are not a diagnosis. They're how your child becomes eligible for special education, and at that point, if it's determined they are and they meet the criteria for 1 or more of those categories, then the IEP team can meet with you and develop your child's IEP, which is great. So if your child was in developmental preschool and started their special education experience there, as they transition to kindergarten, their IDEA special education eligibility category may change. So at that point, what would happen is that your child's IEP team would meet with you. They would assess your child and determine together which category your child now falls under. So sometimes they stay the same and sometimes it changes. So for K through 12th grade, so kindergarten through 12th grade, there are a lot more special education eligibility categories that a child could potentially qualify for an IEP under. So let's go over those as well. We're also going to put another helpful resource from the Department of Education in the comments. It's great. It goes over each of these categories in detail, but I will be referring to it. I admit I have it right here so we can make sure we get that accurate information out to you guys. So first up, I mentioned it previously, autism. So again, your child is either transitioning to kindergarten, or maybe it was decided that your child should be evaluated for special education services when they're in elementary school or even high school. So they go through this assessment process. The team meets together, they determine which category the child is eligible under or categories, and they meet with you. But there are a bunch more options as they are in kindergarten through 12th grade. So autism is the first one. So in regards to the disability eligibility category for an IEP, autism means a developmental disability significantly affecting verbal and nonverbal communication and social interaction, generally evident before age 3, that adversely affects a child's educational performance. Other characteristics often associated with autism are engagement in repetitive activities and stereotyped movements, resistance to environmental change, or change in daily routines, and unusual responses to sensory experiences. So this is in regards to, does this child meet this eligibility category of autism? Autism does not apply if a child's educational performance is adversely affected primarily because of an emotional disturbance, which is a different category. So that's something to note too. And if you have additional questions or have confusion about that, we get this question honestly all the time at Raising Special Kids for families whose children have a medical diagnosis of autism, and kind of helping them navigate why they may or may not have qualified for special education under this category. Please reach out. We will put our information in the comments so we can go over that further with you and help you understand. So the next category, specific learning disability. This is one of the most common categories in the United States for a child to qualify for special education under. Often children who qualify under specific learning disability have dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, that's a hard one to say, dysphagia. And so a specific learning disability is one of the most common categories in the United States for children to become eligible in special education. The next one, other health impairment. So I'm going to refer to the Department of Ed's information on this because this one is a little more lengthy as well. So other health impairment means having limited strength, vitality, or alertness, including heightened alertness to environmental stimuli that results in limited alertness with respect to the educational environment. And it's due to an acute or chronic health problem. Some of the conditions we see that end up having this other health impairment designation are attention deficit disorder, ADHD or ADD, a heart condition, epilepsy, Tourette syndrome, leukemia. There's many more, but really remember the reason why, if they have this condition and why they may be eligible to have an IEP, is if it adversely affects their educational performance. I mentioned emotional disability. This is another common one we see kids qualify under. I am going to also refer to the Department of Ed's explanation because it is lengthy, so bear with me when I get to that. So emotional disturbance means a condition exhibiting one or more of the following characteristics over a period of time, long period of time, and to a marked degree that adversely affects a child's educational performance. Notice how we're saying that a lot, but it's in the wording that it must adversely affect a child's educational performance. An ability to learn that cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors, or an ability to maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers. Maybe they really just struggle socially. Inappropriate types of behavior or feelings under typical circumstances. A general pervasive mood of unhappiness. A tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personal or school problems. Emotional disturbance also can include schizophrenia. All of that being said, a determination of emotional disturbance requires verification of the disorder by a psychiatrist, a licensed psychologist, or a professional counselor, or a clinical social worker. So that, documentation would need to be provided if this category of eligibility was determined appropriate for your child. So I mentioned developmental delay. That is actually a category that comes along with students sometimes from preschool. So up until age 10, this can be a category of eligibility for a child. And they're really looking at that, social, emotional development, physical development, cognitive development, some of those areas of development. If the student is still coming from preschool showing those delays, they can still have this special education eligibility category on their IEP until age 10. And at that point, they would need to be assessed and decide if the child still qualifies for special education and what category they would fall under moving forward. Intellectual disability, orthopedic impairment. Some of these are more easily explained, so I'll just go through them. Multiple disabilities. This is often when two disabilities are combined together, and because of the student having each of these, it more intensely causes severe educational needs and adversely affects their performance in school. Examples of that could be if someone was blind but they also had an intellectual disability, or they had an intellectual disability with orthopedic impairment. Speech and language impairment is another one that comes in K through 12 that was a preschool eligibility category. Traumatic brain injury, visual impairment, and hearing impairment. So those are all of the categories in special education. So we went through the categories for preschool, and then we also went through K through 12. And definitely I encourage you guys to check out the resources from the Arizona Department of Education website if you have, if you want more information in detail, and to please reach out to Raising Special Kids so we can help you understand that process, what the IEP process is like, the evaluation process, help you understand the evaluation results for your child. Some parents are confused. I don't know what category my child qualified under, so we can help you figure that out. So please contact us. Some important points to remember before we wrap up. Special education eligibility label, that is not a medical diagnosis. Having a disability is not enough to qualify for an IEP. The disability must, I'll say it once more, have an adverse effect on the child's education. And having a child that qualifies under one of these eligibility categories is the key to receiving special education supports and services. So you have to have one of those to get an IEP and to qualify for help in school. And the eligibility category, or categories, because some children fall under both, is determined by the multidisciplinary evaluation team, and often called the MET team. And when you're in these meetings, just wrapping up, when you're in these meetings with the school team, the psychologist was there, and often they'll interpret the results and share what it all means. It's okay to ask questions. How is my child determined eligible? I have this medical diagnosis. Tell me how you came to these conclusions for school. It's okay to ask those questions to the team if you need additional help in clarifying that. And of course, we are here for our Raising Special Kids families, especially during this crazy back to school season when we're all helping our children adjust to school for this brand new school year. So just wrapping it up, we're here for you. We're happy that we can be here to support families with their child's needs, especially in special education this time of year. We're super busy taking calls, and we want to help you. So if you have questions about getting your child assessed for an IEP, or if they may qualify, or if they didn't qualify, or what it all means, please reach out. We are here from you. And that's it, guys. We'll see you next time.